Everyone thinks that commercial property is the holy grail for passive income, and well, it kind of is. But I'm going to show you today why buying commercial property too early in your journey may be one of the biggest mistakes that you can make, and why residential property might actually make you richer. The numbers, I think, might surprise you. I'm Ben from Compound Property, and my portfolio now is made up of roughly 50% commercial and 50% residential. But it didn't start that way, and there's a very specific reason for it. At Compound Property, we've helped hundreds of clients purchase residential and commercial property, and I've seen what actually works at different portfolio stages. So here's what we're going to cover today. First, we're going to run through a $1.5 million commercial purchase, as well as what the same money could buy you in residential. We're going to look at the pros and cons of both asset class, and then we're going to see which one actually outperforms when you compare. Then we're going to go into portfolio strategy stage. So when should you buy residential and when should you transition into commercial, if at all? And finally, I'm going to go through the one thing that a lot of investors get wrong when it comes to this decision. But before we get into it, if you're 30 years old thinking, I just want to buy a commercial for passive income, stick around because what I'm going to show you may change your thinking. So firstly, I want to show you what it takes to buy a commercial property versus what it takes to buy a residential property. So we're going to go through things like deposit and cash flow, just so you can get a good sense of what you actually need. These are not hypotheticals either. These are real properties that we've bought real clients in 2025. Okay, so let's jump into an example of a commercial property that we bought this year. So we're going to jump into North Geelong. Now, North Geelong or Geelong is a very strong regional centre in Victoria, and this property presented a really good opportunity for our client. It's an industrial property, but also has a retail component. The business has been here for 20 plus years, and they do fasteners. So they kind of sell to trades and kind of hardware type of business. So let's look into the numbers of what a property like this costs. So we paid $1.25 million for this property. Now, the yield at the time was a little bit under. It worked out to be about 4.7% net yield. Now, net because the tenant pays the outgoings, and that is the difference with commercial and residential. So what that meant was it's $60,000 income on this property. So most importantly, if we look at what it costs to purchase, so to buy a commercial property, typically or generally speaking, you need to put down 30% deposit plus kind of stamp duty and everything like that. So this property at 1.25 million costs 421,000 or cash or equity that you need to make the transaction. Now, if we zoom across to the cash flow, so this property, although it was a 4.7% net yield at the time, the market rent we deemed to be around $90,000 a year, which would have meant that the net yield was a lot closer to 7%. So the difference is though, we can't increase the rent for another 3 years. So if we look at year one, it's positive about 5,000, but by year 4, once we can actually up the rent, it's 28,000 positive. So that is the benefit of commercial, but we are bound by the lease and that can't happen until that period of time. It's not all positive though. Naturally, there are some cons to residential investing as well. The big one is the cash flow. Let's have a look at the cash flow of the property. So if you remember, the commercial gets to roughly 30K positive by year 4 once the rent actually goes to the market. This property though is 11,000 negative. So if we think about that, we've got 11,000 negative. That is a downside of this property, but doesn't necessarily mean it's not the right move. And that's what I want to talk about today. So just keep that in mind. We've done about 120,000 deposit and we're about 11,000 negative cash flow. So we're going to see how that's going to compare to something that is 420,000 deposit and $28,000 positive cash flow. So just to recap, a $1.25 million property in commercial with a 30% deposit plus stamp duty and other costs, legals and things like that has come to $420,000 of cash or equity that you need to buy the property. Okay, so let's jump into a residential purchase now. So this is one that we bought in early or late 2024. I think it's settled in early 25. So this is a 4-bed, 2-bath, 2-car garage on 423 square meters of land, and it is in the northern suburb in Melbourne of Craigieburn. So very good value at the time. We picked this up for $660,000 with a rental income of roughly $600 a week. So the gross yield at that point was 4.7%, which was actually pretty high from Melbourne standards, but that is because we bought it right at the bottom of the cycle in late 2024. We call this a foundation property. So it is a really solid kind of house on a good land content in a growth market, picked with the right market timing. So if we jump into what it costs to purchase this property, so at $660,000 on a 20% deposit, including stamp duty and everything, it's $172,000. But if we jump to an 88% deposit, we could have picked this up for $119,000 investment. So now you have an example of a commercial property and a residential property and what it takes from a deposit perspective to buy both properties. So Now we need to look at the question, which one outperformed? And we will get to that. Before we get to that though, I want to talk about the direct comparison and the pros and cons of residential and a commercial property. So let's break them down. Firstly, starting with residential. If we have a look, the pros of residential is leverage. So on this property, as I mentioned, you could buy on a 10% or 12% or even 20% deposit. So you can see with the residential property, $120,000 investment to get a $660,000 property. However, if we slightly lower the purchase price and bought something for $550,000, we could essentially buy 4 properties for the same deposit amount as that one. So we would have exposure of roughly 4 properties, say around that $600K mark, as opposed to the one residential. And when we go to compare the numbers, that's what we're going to be looking at. With the same deposit, what would the results be as far as the one commercial property or using that deposit into multiple residentials? The other benefit with this is you can also do multiple properties across the portfolio. So you can have diversification. You could buy 3, maybe even 4 properties and spread them all over the country, different markets, different asset types. So you're not reliant on just one property. The other benefit of residential too, it is relatively predictable growth. So even with this one that I just showed you, we bought it at 660. It's already got a bank value at 750. And that means that you're getting predictable long-term capital growth, but you're also getting it easy to access equity. The thing with commercial lending, it is a little bit different, which I'll touch on, but with residential, it's relatively easy to get a revaluation done and then pull your money back out and then put that into another property. Another benefit is it's simple to understand. So everyone understands residential. You know if it's a good house, you know if it's a good area, and you know if the numbers make sense. So residential is a lot less risk involved as opposed to commercial. And when it comes down to selling, it's a lot easier to sell a residential property. Some of these properties that we're buying, they can go in 1 or 2 days. Now, commercial, although it is actually pretty strong right now, it's not always the case depending on the economy. So residential, very easy to sell quickly. Now, we'll go to the negatives of the residential strategy. So the first one and the most obvious one is the cash flow. Yes, it is a bit lower. So in the example I showed before, that property is going to be around minus $11,000 to hold. Now, there are benefits like depreciation, there are benefits like negative gearing, but as a whole, the cash flow is nowhere near as good as commercial. And the second negative, which is on the same theme, is that the reason for that is in residential, the yields are gross yields as opposed to net yields, meaning that in a net yield, the tenant typically pays outgoings, things like insurance, property management, land tax, where in a residential property, you are responsible for all the costs and the gross yields are actually lower. So we're comparing a 4 to 5% gross yield to a 6 to 7% net yield. And with that comes things like ongoing maintenance. So not to say you won't have maintenance in commercial, but you will have some maintenance in your residential property. Now, not every property has a lot of maintenance, but it is definitely something that you need to think about, and it is on you as the landlord. The next one, it's not really a negative, but you do have shorter leases than commercial. So commercial could have a 3, 5, even 20-year lease, where in residential, typically they're 6-month or 12-month. So it's just something to think about, a bit more changeover of tenants. So let's go to the benefits of commercial. Now, the first one is the most obvious, and that is it's cash flow positive from day one. So this is a huge plus of commercial. The second one is you get long leases. So in this example I just showed you, the tenant's been there for 20 years. They've got a new 3-year lease, and you'd expect them to extend on further. Another one is that the tenant pays all the outgoings. So this is what a net yield is, as I mentioned. So they're paying things like insurance, property management, land tax in some cases. So this is a real benefit for the cash flow that you get at the end. When it comes to cash flow too, another benefit is that it's predictable. So you know that for 3 years, you have X amount of cash flow growing at whatever the fixed increases are at the 12-month review of each lease. So you can predict your cash flow long term. And the other benefit is it's just one property as opposed to having to own multiple. So people might find that owning one commercial property may suit them more than multiple residential properties. And on the management side too, they are a bit more low touch. You don't hear too much from the tenants of a commercial property as you would in residential. Now, not everything is positive as always. So with commercial, there are some negatives. The big one, as you've seen, is the high deposit that you need to get in. And this is the biggest problem that I see, is that you need 30% plus cost to get into a commercial property. Another thing too is that the commercial properties, they really only start at $1 million or $1.5 million. Anything less than that, there are options obviously, but they don't carry the same benefit. The next one is you typically need to wait until you lift the income to get more equity growth. So in this case, we need to wait 3 years to be able to get the change in the lease and then get a revaluation done. The third one is vacancy. You probably have heard, and look, it's true, commercial property can have longer vacancy. I mean, in this case, they've been there for 20 years, but if they were to leave, there is a single tenant risk here, and you may have 3, 6, or even 12 months vacancy depending on the timing of the year and how that market is performing. The other one is it can be harder to sell. So if in bad economic times, commercial property being a bigger purchase and smaller buyer pool, they can be harder to sell. So you never want to be in a position where you need to sell them quickly. And then the last thing is that they're more complex and there's a lot more due diligence required. Even when we bought this, there was a significant amount of checks that we needed to do to ensure that this is a good property because there are a lot more ways to go wrong. So now we get to the verdict, and this is what you've been waiting for. What performs better? So the way that I've done this is I've taken that $420,000 as the deposit, and that's the comparison. So with the residential strategy, we could have bought 3 properties for the same price or same deposit as we bought the commercial. Now, technically we could have bought 4 if we just lowered the purchase prices a little bit. So I'm going to show you the comparison there as well. So let's do the comparison. The way that I've done this is I've taken the average annual growth rate of a Melbourne residential house. It's roughly 7%. And I've compared it to the average annual growth rate of industrial property across Australia. I couldn't get specifically Geelong, but it was also around 7% over the last 20 years. So it just shows you they do both grow the same. So this is basically growth minus the negative cash flow as well. So it's taking it all into account. You have a $233,000 gain in 5 years from the one property. In 10 years, you have a $598,000 gain. So basically, if you think about it now, if we were to times that by 3, okay, because that's what we could have bought if we'd gone with the residential strategy. It means in 5 years, we'd be nearly 700,000 up, 699, and in 10 years, would be $1.8 million of capital growth minus the negative cash flow. So that would be the net benefit, $1.8 million. Now, obviously, the cash flow won't be great at this point, but funnily enough, in 10 years' time, the cash flow will be around $1,500 positive across the portfolio. So that's what it would look like. You would have $1.8 million of growth and you'd have $1,500 of cash flow at the end of the day. But if you wanted to be a little bit more aggressive, right, which you definitely can be in the accumulation phase, we could have turned that into 4 deposits, right? Because we'll only use 360,000. We could have also dropped it to 10% deposits rather than 12%. So there's a few things that we could have done, and we could have got it to 4 properties, right? And if we did that, then we would be $2.392 million up. So you can see we would have added on another $700,000. So basically, if you took 4 residential properties, you'd be about $2.4 million in net gain at the end of the 10-year period. So let's compare that to the commercial property. So like I mentioned, $420K buy a $1.25 million property. We would be 5 years in, we would have created $584,000 of growth and cash flow combined. So it's actually a pretty significant return. And anyone that says that commercial doesn't grow, it's simply not true. If you look at the stats, in fact, Sydney industrial was the highest performing outside of farmland over the last 20 years. So it does grow significantly. And if we look at the 10-year return, so this is taking into account growth and cash flow, would be at $1.493 million. So it's actually a pretty good result. Would also be $46,000 cash flow positive by year 10. So by that point, you're holding one property with a $1.493 million gain and a $46,000 passive income. So a really good result. So let's have a look at actually who wins. So in the case of the 3 property portfolio versus the 1 commercial, the 3 property portfolio would have won by around $300,000. So it just goes to show, even with the negative cash flow running at the same growth rate, if you were to leverage into 3 properties, obviously you're taking on more debt and you're going to have negative cash flow along the way, but you would be $300,000 better off in 10 years time. But if you went the 4 properties, and that's when it is around your accumulation phase being aggressive, that's when the big change would have happened. So you would have been $2.392 million up as opposed to $1.493 million up. So you would be an impressive $900,000 up over the 10 years. So basically, if you accumulated 4 properties around that $650K mark versus the 1 industrial property, you'll be $900,000 better off in the 10-year period. Okay, so you can see both are great results, but clearly in this case, accumulating 4 residential properties is going to create a higher net worth in 10 years' time than buying the 1 commercial. But does that mean that residential won? Not necessarily. So in terms of residential won from capital growth, right? And the reason for that, not because it grew more, but because you could use your deposit to leverage into more properties. And the larger your exposure, the better your return is going to be at the end of the day. However, throughout that 10-year hold period, you would have been very negative cash flow because you have accumulated 4 properties on small deposits. So it's not for everyone. And then commercial wins because commercial still grew beautifully. You had a nearly $1.5 million gain and you're $46,000 cash flow positive at the end of the day. However, it didn't create as much equity as the 4 property portfolio strategy. So with this in mind, when should you transition from residential to commercial, if you should at all? Here's what a lot of investors get completely wrong. So a lot of 30-year-olds think, I want to buy commercial property for passive income. And then a lot of 60-year-olds think, I want to buy residential property because it's safer. But both can be mistakes. So the way to think about it is the time to transition is at the right point in your portfolio, as well as what's going to get you to your goals. So as far as working out when the right time is, during the accumulation phase, typically you want to use residential properties to build up your net equity position. The reason for that is, although commercial property is amazing for passive income, the way you need to think about it is every $1 million of commercial property is roughly $60,000 of net income. So if your passive income target is $180,000, you need $3 million of paid off commercial property. So to get there, you're going to need a significant amount of equity. So jumping into a $1 million property too soon may not be the right move. Once you've got your base of residential property, then you can start to leverage the equity into larger commercial properties to start to hit the income. And then in the final phase of your portfolio, typically you want to hold high net yield properties. Now, it doesn't have to be commercial. It might be residential blocks of units. It might be duplexes. It might be triplexes. There's a lot of different style properties you want to own, but typically you want to hold the higher net yield to get that passive income target. So let me address some of the mistakes that I see when people approach residential versus commercial. The first problem I see is something that I mentioned already, is that people look at getting into it too soon. So if you think about it, a good commercial property is typically $1.5 million or more, but people jump in with say $150K deposit. That can buy a $500K commercial property, which the net income on that, it's not going to be significant. As we've discussed here today, rather than taking that on, you're better off to use that money, leverage into residential, build up your asset base so that you can transfer into higher returning commercial properties down the line. The second mistake is I see people don't even entertain commercial property and only want to stick with the same strategy. Now, the reason I say this is wrong is if you keep buying negatively geared properties, at some point you're going to run out of servicing, you're going to run out of cash flow, and you're definitely going to run out of lifestyle. There does need to be a transition at some point. So although residential property has been the thing that's got you there, you do need to start to transition to some sort of higher income producing asset to get the passive income. And the third mistake I see is everyone thinking that they have to go commercial property, and it's absolutely not true. You can still create a passive income through residential. It's just slower, which is fine, and it's not going to get you to your huge numbers, which a lot of people are chasing. So if you want to create the 100 to 150K passive income, you can absolutely do it through residential. Now, you can buy properties like duplexes or triplexes, or as I mentioned, blocks of units, or if you want to go, you can buy high yielding units and get them paid off, and you will achieve your target. So as far as what's better, commercial versus residential, which one will make you rich? Well, essentially both will do the job, but it's just depending on which way you want to go. So the residential is if you want to be aggressive, you want to get your net equity position as high as possible. Commercial is if you want to focus on income, but still get good growth as well. So a typical portfolio journey should look something like this. You start with residential, leverage up your deposit, build your asset base, get your net equity growth, and then transition into higher yielding assets, whether that be residential unit blocks or commercial or other asset types as well. Something that we haven't spoken about though is that not everyone's goal is to create high net worth. Some people want income, and therefore jumping straight into commercial, knowing that you are sacrificing some net worth, is actually not a bad idea as well. So you can see it really comes down to the personal situation. Now, I'm not just talking the talk, I'm also walking the walk. You would have heard me say at the start of this video, my portfolio is 50% commercial and 50% residential. Now, it obviously at the start was 100% residential, and that allowed me to get into this position. But the way I look at it moving forward is, for me, passive income is actually my number one goal. I want to hit a certain amount, and for me, residential is not going to get me there, or if it will, it's going to take me a very long time and a lot of properties. So I am buying higher net yield commercials, but I don't want to just buy commercial either, because I know it can be prone to vacancy, it can be prone to economic downturn, and residential is still a much safer asset, and it does grow very predictably, as we've seen. So the way I'm looking at it is I'm still buying what we call legacy properties at compound property, and that is residential blocks of units, because I kind of see that as the best of both worlds. You get the residential stability, the residential growth, but you also get a kind of, it's like a commercial net cash flow in a way, because they're like 6 or 7% gross yields. So they're still like a 5% net yield, which is a really good result. So if you want help building a property portfolio and you're not sure which step you should take next, reach out to us at Compound Property, because we're buying residential and commercial properties Australia-wide for our clients so that they can build out their property portfolio.